change your mind compared to what you've already heard about and discussed during the long term and the long semester. So as David was mentioning, I'm teaching at the University of Exeter in the UK. I've been working on the Gulf Monarchies for quite a long time now. I did my PhD on the Sultanate of Oman. So on this country here in the south of the Arabian Peninsula. I've been working at the University of Exeter, where there is a center dedicated to the Gulf and to the Arabian Peninsula, it's a Center for Gulf Studies, which was established at the end of the 70s. So that's one of the longest, still working center dedicated to the Gulf and the Arabian Peninsula outside the region, outside the Arabian Peninsula, obviously. So. What I will talk about today is I'll talk about economic challenges in the Gulf monarchies. What I'll talk about, I'll briefly present the economy of these countries, and especially highlighting the fact that the role of oil and petrodollars in the economy of the region. Explaining to what extent it has led to contribute to a certain extent to explain political structures in these countries through a theory called the rentier state theory, which is a political economy, a political science theory, not an economy one. And I'll discuss the limits of this theory. And what I'll do in the second part of the lecture is to discuss actually the challenges that these countries are facing, these regimes are facing, economically and politically. And I'll finish by talking about the visions. You probably heard about the Saudi Vision 2030 promoted by Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia. All these countries have developed national visions. And I'll try to explain to what extent these visions are related to these economic challenges that these countries are facing, but even more, according to me, politically speaking, the role that they are playing in terms of politics, even more than economics. I think it, for some reason. Non. Yeah. Yeah. Les connexions. Je peux repartager.
Connecte-toi. Non, mais je pense que. Vas-y, partage pour voir. Là, ça marche ou pas? C'est chez toi ou... Oui. C'est bon? Okay.
Okay, good. So the 6 countries I'll especially talk about are Saudi Arabia and the 5 smaller Gulf monarchies, so Kuwait, Bahrain, which is here, the Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, and Oman. These are the 6 countries which are composing the Gulf Cooperation Council, the 6 Gulf monarchies. When we talk about oil monarchies in the Arabian Peninsula, these are the 6 countries. So a few basic facts on these countries. The first one, as you can see in terms of independence, they are extremely recent countries. Apart from Saudi Arabia, which got its independence in the 30s, the other ones have been independent only for the last 50 or 60 years maximum. All countries are ruled by, they are monarchies, so they are ruled by ruling families, except in the United Arab Emirates, which is a federation of 7 emirates. So basically you have 7 small monarchies composing a federation of the Federation of the United Arab Emirates. And with Abu Dhabi being the capital of the United Arab Emirates, the biggest city in the United Arab Emirates and the richest one. what is interesting also to notice is that these monarchies didn't fight for their independence. So in terms of political legitimacy, that's quite interesting, because compared to what we have in countries like Egypt or Algeria or Syria or Iraq, historically, the countries I just mentioned got their independence after fighting against the colonizer. And so there is a political legitimacy related to the fight for the national liberation. In the Gulf monarchies, that's not the case. The Gulf monarchies got their independence from the British. They owed their independence from the British, and the ruling families in particular. So the ruling families are on the throne after being granted independence from the British. So they have not fought for that. And it creates interesting dynamics in terms of state-society relations, because even in authoritarian contexts, we'll see that they are authoritarian, but what is interesting is that the opposition or the society in general is very well aware of the fact that there is no political legitimacy for these ruling families related to national liberation or fight against the colonizer. So when you have protests, as it was the case during the Arab uprisings in 2011 and 12, and later on also, that's something that the opposition is telling the monarchy, is reminding the monarchy. We know, we remember that you were not, you have not been independent after fighting against the colonizer, but you were granted it. In terms of statistics in relation to neighboring countries, what is interesting to notice is that, apart from Saudi Arabia, which is approximately 22 million, composed of 22 million nationals. The other ones are very small in terms of number of nationals. And especially in comparison with countries like Iran, Iraq, or Yemen. And in all Gulf monarchies, but we'll have the occasion to briefly discuss it, there is a very substantial non-national population in these countries, which is composed of people who came to as a labor force or a workforce coming to these countries since the 50s and the 60s, right? So in countries like, what is also interesting to notice, just as a note here, is that there is no official censuses, or at least no publicized public censuses. So these are estimates only. And usually these figures are extremely sensitive, politically speaking, so there is no official figures proposed by the governments. In a country like Qatar, you have 300,000 inhabitants, nationals, 300,000 only, in a total Qatari population, but you have approximately 2.8 million foreigners living in Qatar, so 8 times more than the number of nationals. In the UAE, you have quite the same proportion, 1.3 million nationals compared to approximately 10 million non-nationals, which create also interesting dynamics in terms of, again, state-society relations, and in terms of what is to be, for instance, a Qatari national or a UAE national in a country where you are an extreme minority compared to the total population. So when you look at the total figures of these 6 countries, you can see that the non-national population in these monarchies is approximately 33 million in total, which is approximately the number of nationals when you add the 6 countries, right? So Saudi Arabia and Oman are the only countries where the nationals are in a majority compared to the non-national population. Why oil is important here? That's quite obvious, you probably know about that, but just some reminders. The fact that in terms of oil production at the moment, when you have the top 10, the ranking of the top 10 oil producers, quite a substantial number are belonging to the region. So Saudi Arabia is the second one, UAE, Kuwait, Iran and Iraq are also in the top 10. As you know, the US is by quite far at the moment the top oil producer in the world, especially in relation due to the production of shale oil and shale gas, which has completely changed the balance. In terms of crude oil reserves, that's even more, I mean, the region is even more important than production itself, because you can see that Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, the UAE, Kuwait are in the top 5 or 6 in the world, apart from Venezuela, which is the country where you have the biggest oil reserves. And the same for natural gas. Natural gas, you have, again, in the top 10, you have the UAE and Saudi Arabia, but especially Qatar, which is third in the world for natural gas production. So Qatar, which is this small country, is not, I mean, contrary to what the image that we have, is not producing much oil, but is producing mainly natural gas. So one point to keep in mind is that, contrary to the image that we may have, the economy and the history or the political history of this region didn't start with oil, right? There was a political history, there was an economic history before oil in the Arabian Peninsula. In particular, the region was, before until the end of the 20th century, was at a crossroad between the Mediterranean, East Africa, and South Asia. I mean, the Indian subcontinent in particular, but also Central Asia. So that was a very important crossroad in terms of trade, but also in terms of in relation to the pilgrimages. I'm coming back to the first slide. Mecca and Medina, the two main holy sites of Islam, are in Saudi Arabia nowadays. So pilgrimages, economically speaking, have always been, since the beginning of Islam, a very important component of the economy of the region. Because as you can imagine, before the middle of the 20th century, when people were doing the pilgrimage to Mecca and Medina, they were not traveling for 2 or 3 days. They were traveling for weeks, sometimes for months, due to the cost of it, due to the time to travel. So there was a lot of trade related to pilgrimages. People were traveling and trading and selling and buying goods on the trip from Central Asia or from North Africa, from Turkey, from the Indian subcontinent. So pilgrimages have been a very important element in the economy of the region before oil, and until now again, of course. So this map is giving you the dates of the productions in the region, of the beginning of the exploration of oil in the region. What is interesting to notice is that the first place where oil was discovered and exploited in the region is in what is now Azerbaijan, which was under the Tsar, the Russian Empire, and then the Soviet Union after 1917, so just north of Iran. But the first place on this map was Iran, and oil was exploited since the first decade has been exploited since the first decade of the 20th century. What you can see also is that in the Arabian Peninsula, it came much later. So Bahrain was the first place, 1930s. Then Saudi Arabia, end of the 1930s. And countries like the UAE or Oman, much later again, around 50s and 60s. Why is it important? Because it will have an impact, politically speaking. It's not a coincidence, I don't know if you heard about that, but during the Arab uprisings in 2011, the main protests that developed in the region were in Bahrain, right? I will show you some pictures later. This is the place where the biggest protest took place in the region. And the reason is that this is not a coincidence that the place where oil was discovered the first in the Arabian Peninsula, because since the 30s in Bahrain, you've had trade union movements related to the oil sector and the oil industry. You've had political activism related to the oil sector and the oil industry, because the oil companies at the time were sending people from Bahrain to be trained in Cairo, in Baghdad, in the UK or in the US. And these people were coming back to Bahrain in the 40s and 50s with political ideas, with, for instance, Arab nationalist ideas, with socialist ideas, communist ideas, and so on. And they were coming back with the idea of developing political activism and also developing trade unions in Bahrain very early on in the oil industry. So this is the reason why you've had this connection. I mean, the fact that the oil industry has been extremely important in understanding contemporary political development. I think that's what I wanted to say here. So, oil has been discovered and exploited since then. Initially, the exploitation of it was done by multinational companies. I mean, international multinational companies like UK and US ones, the ones that we have in mind, for instance, BP or Shell until now. And all these countries will decide to nationalize their oil sector fully, from exploration to exploitation to export, between the 50s and the early 70s. They will decide that because they have understood, obviously, that the way how these private oil companies were exploiting oil was done for the purpose and for the interest of these companies, but not necessarily for the interest of the local populations. So these regimes will decide progressively, after Iran did it in the 50s, to nationalize their own industries, and it happened. And by the end of the 70s, all oil exploration and exploitation in the region became fully nationalized. So that's the case now, for instance, with in Saudi Arabia with Aramco, which is the legacy of an American company, Arabian-American oil company, Aramco. And it was nationalized between the 60s and the late 70s, and it's now fully owned by the Saudi government, apart from 5%, which were put on the stock market. For other countries, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, they are all fully nationalized. So what is the impact politically of, first, economically? What is a rentier state? So that will give me the possibility to discuss what, this rentier state theory and this potential connection between economy and politics in the region. So a basic definition of rent is the fact that it's an income not originating from the productive activity, right? What is a rentier state based on this, economically speaking? It's a state whose revenues derive predominantly from a rent or from a foreign source. That's not necessarily the case only with oil. It can be with, of course, natural gas. So there are plenty of countries which are considered as rentier states beyond the Gulf monarchies. For instance, Norway can be considered as 70% or even sometimes, depending on years, more than 70% of the state revenues of Norway are coming from oil and natural gas. Russia, at the moment. In Africa, you have countries like Algeria, Angola, Gabon, Libya, Nigeria. You have countries in Asia like Brunei, Indonesia. But there are other countries, there are other rents, possible rents. Diamond can be considered as a rent for Botswana, for instance. More than 70% of the state revenues of Botswana are coming from the exploitation of diamond. Or other minerals, we can talk about copper with Chile. With the Democratic Republic of Congo, we have all the new metals and minerals like rare earths, like cobalt, lithium, and others. Lithium in Chile also. And Mongolia or Zambia also related to copper, cobalt, and so on. So why can we consider it as a foreign source or as a rent for these countries? Because they are exploiting it, they are extracting it and exporting it. So in that sense, it's a rent if you don't add any value, or if you don't refine it, or if you don't transform the product, you just extract the raw material and export it. So that can be considered as a rent, economically speaking, because you don't do anything apart from extracting it and this godsend in a way, and exporting it. If you start transforming it, if you start refining oil, for instance, or transforming oil and petrochemical products, or oil products into petrochemicals, into plastics, and so on, that's not anymore rent, because you are adding a value, you are transforming this raw material into a product with an added value. So in the Gulf monarchies at the moment, 70 to 80% of the state revenues are basically deriving from the oil extraction or the hydrocarbon extraction. In that sense, they are rentier states until now. Why has it been important economically and politically? Economically, it has been important because suddenly the ruling families were recipient of massive oil revenues, petrodollars, coming to their coffers, especially after the nationalization of these companies. So all the oil revenues were, directly coming to the coffers of the state. And the state, in an authoritarian context with the ruling families, there is not much difference between state and ruling family coffers. So basically, they were recipients of these massive oil revenues, and they were in a capacity to distribute it or to redistribute it at their will, right? So one of the ways to do that was to try to buy legitimacy at home, to make people forget about the fact that they had no political legitimacy out of the fact that, apart from the fact that they got the throne from the British. And that was a way for them to buy legitimacy through spending on massive welfare programs, on through food subsidies, free health and education for nationals, or through investment in other countries, funding, for instance, charity organizations in other poorer Islamic or Muslim countries, or doing massive military deals with countries like the US, the UK, France, or Russia. That's a way to buy legitimacy internationally, but that's a way to to make these international countries or these countries good friends and protectors of your throne. So the way how this ruling families, it was a way for them to buy legitimacy at home. I will just give you a few examples. In that sense, the role of the state has been an instrument of resource allocation, in a way, so redistribution of the oil rent through these mechanisms, and by reducing the taxes on the individual incomes for nationals only, of course, not for foreigners. So what are these few examples? How policies of energy redistribution could become tools of legitimization in Gulf monarchies, but also in Iran or in Iraq. First, as I said, there has been almost no tax on individual incomes for nationals, right? So for any, public or private sector jobs for nationals in these monarchies, usually you don't pay taxes at all on your income. The second element is, as I said, heavy subsidies on petrol, water, electricity prices, and even some food prices. For instance, in Qatar, Qatari nationals don't pay at all water and electricity. It's free for Qatari nationals. For food prices in Bahrain, in a country like Bahrain, which is probably the poorest of these Gulf monarchies, the meat for nationals is sold at 20% its value. 80% of the price of the meat is subsidized by the state. So again, it's a way to massively change the state-society relation and to try to present yourself as a ruling family, as benevolent, as protector of your nation, and so on. Of course, it affects only nationals, non-foreigners, right? Free education for nationals, until now it's almost the case everywhere, even higher education. There are some fees sometimes implemented, but it's extremely limited, again for nationals only. Free healthcare for nationals, same. And in countries like a country like Qatar, for instance, when the state, when there is a particular surgery, a particular, surgery taking place and which cannot be done at home, the state will fund your travel to Thailand or to Germany to make your your surgery taking place. So the state will fund everything for you, travel, cost of surgery, everything, because, again, for nationals only. Provision of government and housing and free land, I won't talk about that much. Rulers' gifts, that's something also that has been implemented quite a lot. So on specific occasions, national days or specific difficult situations like at the time of the Arab uprisings, a number of these monarchies decided to to make gifts in the name of the ruler to show the fathers of the nation's benevolence towards their nationals. So for instance, in Saudi Arabia, the previous king of Saudi Arabia at the time of the Arab uprisings decided to spend within a few months $32 billion in massive gifts, in massive gifts to the nationals to try to prevent any protest taking place in the country. The same for Bahrain, where the protests took place anyway, but the king of Bahrain 1 month before had decided to allocate $2,000 for each national in order to make sure that, or try to prevent nationals from going to the street like in Tunisia or in Egypt. It didn't work. Another element is bureaucratization of the society. The fact that these countries have developed massive civil and military public sectors, civil and military, in order to employ as many nationals as possible. So that's again a way to show the nationals that the state or the ruling family, and the border is quite difficult to establish, is here to protect you and to give you a job and to make sure that you are benefiting from the oil rent and from the national wealth. Another type of energy redistribution has been the kafala system, or the sponsorship system. You probably heard about that. In all these monarchies, if you want to work as a foreigner in, let's say, in Doha, in Qatar, or in Dubai, or in Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia, you have to be sponsored by a national, except in some free zones and so on. There are some specific zones where companies don't need to have a local sponsor. But in general, you have to be sponsored by a national, either a national company or a national individual. And it's, again, a way to redistribute the oil rent, because the nationals, either the company or the individuals, will act as a gatekeeper. They will in fact benefit from the fact that there are many foreigners coming to the country. Just the fact that they have a national passport will give them the possibility to sponsor foreigners. And for instance, the rule has been that if you want to establish, for instance, a company in Dubai or in Riyadh at the moment, you will have to find a local partner, and in order to create this local company. And this local company will be controlled at least at 51% by the national in any case. Apart from, of course, again, free zones, which is a bit different. But in that sense, nationals will sell their status of citizens to foreign partners, so that will be a rent for nationals. Just to give you an idea of the labor market at the moment, when you look at the orange and pink, orange and yellow together, which represent the share of expatriates, so foreign nationals on the job market, the full job market, both private and public sector, you will see that in a country like the United Arab Emirates, both yellow and orange make approximately 95% of the total job market. So the total job market is composed of 95% of foreigners. It's a bit less in countries where there is a need, where there is a bigger population, and where there is more youth unemployment than in Qatar or the United Arab Emirates. For instance, in Saudi Arabia, there has been a need to replace foreigners by nationals. But in Saudi Arabia, when you look at the full labor market, the foreigners remain in a majority on the labor market, right? For different reasons, we can discuss about that. And I don't have it, I think. No. Interestingly, it has an impact on gender balance also, because a vast majority of the foreigners who are coming to work, who are foreigners and coming to work are males, because they are working in the construction sector, they are working in other places. So when you look at a city like Dubai or like Doha, you can see that in the dark blue, the males are representing more than 70% of the total population of these cities. As you know, as a natural growth, I mean, there is in a global population, there are approximately 51% of females and 49% of males. So now, in a country like Doha or Dubai, you have more than approximately 3/4 of males in the city and 1/4 of female. You can imagine the kind of imbalance and the kind of problems it can create in terms of gender relations, a bit like national, non-national relations in such a context. And a last important policy of energy redistribution element, which I think is important to keep in mind, is that beyond this universal redistribution schemes that I mentioned, which are to which all nationals are in theory eligible, you will have individualized favors to some specific sectors or specific individuals of the country, which the regime or the ruling family considers itself particularly indebted, and they really need to protect. And this is the case, for instance, of the big business sectors. The big companies, they are particularly important for the stability of these countries, because they are usually allied economically and financially with the ruling families. So they absolutely need to be protected and to be part of the system. So what happens is that these big business companies, in fact, they will be granted most of the public contract, public sector contract or construction contracts or infrastructure contracts, like in NEOM, for instance, at the moment, or in other big projects. They will be granted, they will be allocated these big contracts, and it has been the case since the 50s and 60s. So they have been massively benefiting from this development. But they will also be the ones who will control imports of basic goods to the country. For instance, Qatar has been importing something like 95% of its basic goods, like fruit and vegetables, for instance. So there needs to be companies which are acting as importers of these basic goods for Qatar. And of course, who is controlling these imports? This will be the same big businesses. So these big businesses will benefit from public contracts, but they will also benefit from the fact that with the development of economic development in these countries and the rent which is redistributed to individuals, these individuals will spend money at home in buying goods, in buying, I don't know, goods and services and so on. And who will sell these goods and services? These are the big business companies. So they will benefit themselves. They will be a rentier, and they will benefit from this, redistribution even more than others. So based on that, there is a political science theory which has been developed, which is called the rentier state theory. What is the idea of it? I mean, it was based on the cases of Venezuela, which is an oil producer, also Iran and the Netherlands, which is another oil producer. What is the idea behind it? The idea is that rentier states are not expected to democratize as long as they remain rentier, so as long as they benefit from this kind of rent. What is the idea behind that? Because as long as the state is in a position to prevent political contestation by spreading this wealth or by redistributing this wealth, it doesn't need democratic legitimation. So the idea of this theory is to say there is a clear link between being a rentier state, especially an oil rentier, and being authoritarian. Because if you are in a capacity not to rely on taxes or on taxations in order to fill your state budget, as long as you rely only on oil rent coming to your coffer directly, you don't need taxation, you don't need support from the citizen. The state-society relation is completely is different, because you are the ones who are redistributing this money and making sure that people kind of remain happy. So that's a kind of process of reverse taxation, we can say. You probably know the very famous formula at the end of the 18th century in the US, no taxation without representation. So this idea that the US population or the US citizens of the new state were saying, okay, we are happy to, or we agree to be taxed as long as we know how this money is used by the state, and as long as the state is accountable to us as citizens. Okay, we can fund the state through taxation, but we need to know how this money is used. So that was the idea of no taxation without representation. If we are taxed, then we need to be represented by the House of Congress in the US. The House of Congress will be here to check what the state is doing with the taxation and with the money collected from citizens. In the case of the Gulf monarchies, it's the kind of the contrary. The ruling families are telling their citizens, you are not taxed, right? So why would you be politically represented? Why would there be parliament? You are not taxed. You just rely on for your living on the money that we as ruling family are redistributing to you. If you want to be represented, if you want to have a parliament which is checking on the state budget, then you will have to accept to be taxed, right? As long as you are not taxed, why would you have a say in how the money of the state budget and the money is used? Because that's not your money. That's the money that we are redistributing to you, right? So that's no representation without taxation. If you want to be represented, you will have to be taxed. So as long as there is no financial crisis for these states, as long as they don't need to cut on expenditures, on redistribution, as long as they don't need to raise taxes, according to the theory, there is no reason why there would be democratization. So in principle, this idea seems kind of common sense or can make sense to a certain extent. But I think there are many problems with such a theory, which is quite simplistic. The first one is that it gives the perception that the state is homogeneous, that the state is a black box where basically ruling family, state, and all state actors are kind of agreeing on keeping the status quo. And so it doesn't say anything about how the state actually, in terms of political science, works. It doesn't say anything about the debates within the ruling family or the ruling elite. So that's quite problematic from a political science perspective, because as soon as you are not able to understand, for instance, you probably remember in 2018 when Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia decided to jail quite a number of his relatives from the ruling family, and such a move of jailing your own ruling family members or your own relatives cannot be explained by such a theory, right? So it considers the state as a kind of a black box which is not discussed. The other problem with this theory is that it gives the perception that there is no politics or there is no history or there is no economics before oil. So in these countries, we don't know what happened. I mean, that's kind of a no man's land in terms of politics and in terms of history before oil. There was no political conflicts, there was no opposition, there was no political debate, according to the theory. And suddenly, with oil, all the history can be explained by the discovery of oil and the explanation by oil. So it kind of supports very much the ideologies of these ruling families, which is saying these ruling families are telling their nationals, look, you don't need to be interested in politics. There is nothing to be interested in. We are all the same country. As long as we are redistributing oil to you, why would you start complaining? Why would you divide the nation and this kind of thing? We are all we are all following the same national goals and national unity goals, right? So it's kind of erases this idea that there would be political contestation, political opposition, and so on in these countries. And one of the best counterexamples is what happened in Bahrain in 2011 during the Arab uprisings. Massive protests in the capital of Bahrain. There was probably in Bahrain, I mean, the population of Bahrain, national population is 700,000 inhabitants, so it's very small. But probably there was 150 to 200,000 nationals at the same time in the street. So we can probably say 25% of the nation of Bahrainis were in the street at the same time on two occasions in February and March 2011. So in that sense, I mean, that's when you, in terms of relative value, I mean, it's not, Egypt has not matched the same figures, or Tunisia or Syria. Of course, they are much bigger countries, so it's difficult to have the same proportion of nationals in the street at the same time. But in Bahrain, there were major protests. And these protests were cross-sectarian. They were not based on particular, I mean, sect or so. They were showing that in fact, there is a political history and a political activism in these countries. The third one is that it tends to neglect the existence of counterexamples. There are counterexamples. There are examples of countries which are rentier and which are democratic. Norway is one of the best examples. Norway is an extremely rentier state, and at the same time, it's considered in all rankings as one of the most accountable and transparent countries in the world. We can discuss about that. But anyway, Norway is widely known as a democracy. Other countries, I mean, Indonesia is a rentier state, and it's a democracy. There is a democratic alternation. The same in Nigeria. The same in Venezuela before Maduro. So Venezuela has been for several decades a democracy. So there are countries which are rentier and which are democratic. So there are counterexamples to this theory. And there are oil monarchies which were overthrown while they were oil rentier. So it's the fact that you are an oil rentier state doesn't mean that you will be stable forever. Iraq is a good example, 1958. Libya with Colonel Gaddafi in 1969. And the last one is that, and it relates to what I just mentioned, it relies exclusively on the tax hypothesis, this idea that the only reason why people would go to the street is because of taxation, because they are taxed. No, people are going to the street for many other reasons than being taxed. They are going to the street for social justice, for freedom of expression, because of social inequalities, economic inequalities, plenty of other reasons. And this was the case during the Arab uprisings. During the Arab uprisings, the price of oil was very high. So according to the theory, there was no reason why people would go to the street because the state was in a situation to redistribute money. But people went to the street for questions like everywhere else in the world, for social justice, for freedom of expression, for questions which are related to political freedoms. And the same recently, the Gen Z protest, you heard about that, Gen Z protest in Indonesia in the autumn 2025. Price of oil is quite high, so there is no reason why people would go to the street in Indonesia at the moment. But this is a democracy, and they went to the street again. So that counters the theory in many ways. So I don't say that the theory should be completely disregarded, but I think it's in many ways very orientalist or very approaching the region in ways which are really problematic in many ways because they tend to give the image of a region which has no political history, no political interest, which is different than Egypt or other countries in the world, and where, in fact, people are generally happy with the situation. So that's really problematic in itself. So, do I have 15 minutes or 20 minutes? Okay. So, these ruling families have implemented what we call, what I can call strategies of legitimation, because no authoritarian regime can rely only on repression. It's impossible. Even a country like, North Korea doesn't rely only on repression. It relies also on the fact that there are sectors of the society which have an interest in maintaining the regime, which have an interest in the status quo. For instance, the business elite, for instance, the security sectors, because they are paid and they are part of the system and they are benefiting from it directly. Of course, repression is an extremely important element and should not be disregarded, definitely not. But we cannot only imagine that an authoritarian regime can rely only on repression. It's impossible. And in the Gulf monarchies, repression has been extremely tough since 2011, definitely. In all countries, there have been political prisoners, there have been political executions in all countries, academics jailed, academics sentenced. We have a colleague in Exeter who has been in jail for 4 years now in Saudi Arabia and is belonging to the University of Exeter. He has been detained incommunicado by the Saudi government. He's Saudi himself. So repression has been extremely tough. But the thing is that they have to develop also other strategies of legitimation beyond repression to try to explain that they are the best rule possible and to try to convince the population. And these strategies of legitimation have reached their limit. One of them is the reliance on the oil rent to buy off consent. I won't go back on that. There are counterexamples. The blackmailing strategies. A number of regimes are saying, that's either me or the chaos. You don't want to be like Yemen. You don't want to be like Libya. You don't want to be like Iraq after 2003, right? That's civil war. So maybe you don't like me, but at least that's not the chaos in your country. So better this solution than the chaos. And this strategy has been more difficult to implement than before. The political economy segregation related to the kafala system. That's something that has been very useful for these regimes. Why? Because it's an extremely powerful way to talk to your nationals by saying, look, you are surrounded by foreigners. 90% of the population is foreign. You don't want me as a ruler to open naturalization to all these guys and basically to give them the same privileges or the same benefits than you have, right? So if I start opening naturalization to many foreigners, the oil cake will remain the same, but it will have to be divided between many more people, right? So you don't have to sympathize with foreign workers, even if they are dying on the construction sites and so on. There is absolutely no interest for you in sympathizing and in making some cross-national political activism, right? So this segregation, this political economic segregation has been extremely powerful in terms of blackmailing the national population. But it's more difficult than before to implement that. The rhetoric according to which reforms and political liberalization come at their own pace. That's something we hear and continue hearing about the Middle East, you know. The Middle East is not ready for democracy. That's the kind of narrative that especially neoconservative movements in the US have been proponing. The region is not ready for reforms, for political liberalization. It will come at its own pace. Again, this is problematic. And this is countered by the protests in 2011, which have in fact inspired protests in Hong Kong later on, protests of the indignados in Spain, protests of Occupy Wall Street. All these movements in the world were inspired by the Arab uprisings. So this idea that people in the region would be not culturally ready for democracy, that's something that is crap. And it's also something that works much less than before. And the idea that politics is a dangerous game, that's something that also can be convincing. When you are a national, you know that if you start talking about the ruler, you can be jailed very quickly, just out of a tweet, or just out of a post on Instagram. So you can discuss plenty of things. You can say, oh, the country is very corrupt and so on, but up to a point. So there is a red line which is talking about really politics and talking especially about the ruling family. As soon as this is addressed, that becomes a very dangerous game. So such a strategy has been useful. It has completely shown its limits in 2011 and 12, but now the regimes are becoming even more repressive than before. And it's becoming, again, something quite convincing for many nationals because of all the protesters who were jailed or killed. So what are the structural challenges? And I will talk about, and I will finish by that, the structural challenges that these countries are facing at the moment. And which explain in a way, and we can discuss that in the discussion, the visions that these rulers are promoting. The first main challenge is the fact that in all these countries, more than 50% of the population is under 24. You have here some figures. This is the case all across the region. The Middle East is one of the youngest regions in the world with sub-Saharan Africa. But in a country like, even in Saudi Arabia, you can see that people who are under 30, they are almost 60%. And under 15 in particular, they are around 25%. So 25% of the population in Saudi Arabia, nationals, I'm talking about nationals, is under 15. So that's a major problem. I mean, you can imagine how youth is usually considered economically as an asset, because youth means innovation, means new ideas, means better education in general than previous generations. But for these regimes, they consider it as a problem. They consider it as a problem because of all this, because of the new ideas, because of the innovation and the possibilities to challenge the regimes. And the fact that this is in particular a very educated young population, very educated. Just an interesting element is that the ratio of graduation between males and females in higher education is in favor of females by far in all these countries. Just to give you an example, in Qatar, I mean, you'll look at these slides if you are interested. This is all the countries of the world in terms of ratio between male and female in higher education. So here you have the parity, gender parity. This is the line here. You can see that in the vast majority of the world, it's above this line. So that means there is a disparity in favor of females compared to males in higher education, almost everywhere. If you look at orange and green, orange means registration, and green means completion of degrees. So the differential, I mean the difference of ratio, is even more important when we talk about completion. So not only females are usually more numerous in higher education, but they are more successful in completing the degrees. And when you look at the region in the Middle East, here countries like Qatar or Kuwait, they are not even here in the graph, because there are 12 times more females, Qatari females, graduating in higher education in Qatar than males, 12 times more. So, and this is the case all over the region. I mean, not to such an extent, but definitely there are many more females graduating than males in higher education. It goes with massive youth unemployment. And this is the perspective, I mean, that is usually something we don't have in mind. Even in countries like Saudi Arabia, here, you have here the unemployment in the dark green. You have unemployment youth compared to the total youth population. In Saudi Arabia, we can consider that there are 30% of the youth which is unemployed. Saudi Arabia. In countries like Jordan, it's 35%. Of course, in the Palestinian territories, that's much more, and even more since the 7th of October. But even in countries which are rich and small, like Kuwait, we can consider that probably 15% of the youth is unemployed. So it's a major problem that these countries are facing also. So a very young population, very educated, especially females, massive youth unemployment, so incapacity of the system to create jobs for the youth, and poverty, because it goes together. These countries are extremely rich in principle when you look at their GDP, but in terms of redistribution, it's absolutely not the case. Redistribution is extremely unequal, of course. We are in an authoritarian context. For instance, in a city like Mecca, so the holy site of Islam, we consider that there is probably 1 million people living in slums in Mecca, 1 million people, and not only foreigners, many nationals. And there are approximately 70 slums in Mecca, which make 25% of the city space. And we talk about Mecca, which is the city, which is supposed to be protected by the Saudi Arabia in terms of the holy city of Islam. Massive inequalities, it goes with it. One statistics, when you look at top 1% versus bottom 50% of the population, for instance, in Qatar, you have 25, the top 10%, the top 1% receive 25% of the income. And I'm not even talking about assets, I'm talking about only incomes, but in terms of actual assets, that's even more important in terms of inequalities. And the Middle East is considered by all experts, including people like Thomas Piketty, you may have heard of him, and his team, as the most unequal region in the world. The top 1% in the Middle East in general is richer compared to other top 1% compared to Brazil, India, or South Africa, which are considered already extremely unequal countries. So all these elements about, I'm not talking even about the impact of climate change. So this are the structural challenges that these countries are facing. And one of the final challenges that they are facing is that oil itself is becoming less and less useful in order to appease the population. Because when you look at the cost of a barrel of oil between countries, in country like Saudi Arabia, for instance, is extremely cheap. In order to produce a barrel of oil, it's actually $10 a barrel, or even less sometimes. In some parts of Iraq, it's $2 to $3 a barrel, because it's very easy to extract. It's a very good quality of oil, so $3 a barrel to produce it. The problem is that, it doesn't say much, the cost of the production. What is more interesting to have in mind is what we call the fiscal break-even oil price. I don't know if you had the occasion to discuss it in other contexts. This is the price of the barrel of oil which is needed to balance the state budget for a country because of their expenditures and because of in order to take into account other expenditures and other revenues. For a country like Saudi Arabia at the moment, Saudi Arabia needs a barrel of oil at $85 a barrel. Why? Because of the massive investments that Saudi Arabia is doing in relation to the national vision, in relation to NEOM, and the fact that more and more, the national population in Saudi Arabia is, needs more and more redistribution because it's growing, right? And when you look at countries like Iran, for instance, and that's not a surprise when we see the protests that have been taking place again recently, Iran needs a $125 a barrel in order to balance its budget, which is impossible. At the moment, the barrel of oil is between $70 and $80, depending on days. So even a country like Saudi Arabia is just at the limit, constantly about balancing its budget. And it has been, it has not been able to balance its budget before last year. For 10 years, it could not balance its budget. So even fiscally speaking, financially speaking, Saudi Arabia is not in a capacity, has to face the issues of balancing the budget. I think I'll stop here, maybe. And we can discuss other elements like during the Q&A about ways of diversification of revenues and national visions, maybe. Thank you so much.